Hey, this is John Reed, Diginomica. I got Brian Sommer in the chair. How you doing, Brian?
Doing pretty good. And we're here in lovely Atlanta. We're trying to get this in just before all the presidential debate candidates show up and screw up the highways here. So,
Oh my gosh, it's going to be crazy. And yeah, we are on site. This is probably our last sit down of the conference tour. And no, this is not an astounding ERP meeting, although that would have been great. This was Sage analyst event. So we got an earful from Sage execs yesterday, and then we did some one-on-ones today.
mhm.
So we thought we would try to make sense of Sage and then probably release a short separate podcast on um, what CFOs are struggling with, what today's CFO looks like, because that was a kind of a theme that I'd like to get into from the show. But Brian, I'm going to just kick it over to you. We had a Transform user event I was at in February. There was some really interesting stuff discussed there around, I think, under CTO Aaron Harris, they have a very interesting AI strategy, but it kind of came down to some things that were said there around we want to eliminate the close, which sent some shockwaves through the audience a little bit. Customers like discussing this topic of reducing chores around finance and especially the close. But of course, eliminating the close is not exactly a super friggin' easy, as you pointed out. So what do you make of all this? Where are you with Sage at the moment?
Well, I think it's great to have aspirational goals. I really do. The problem that most companies are going to have is not every bit of software they own came from Sage or is part of the Sage Intacct product line. So you're going to be somewhat limited on what you can do. And you might be a company where your close gets hung up waiting on financial data from a subsidiary that you may not own 100% of or may not fully control. So there's a bunch of reasons why that dream may not be realized for all customers. But the goal, I think, is a great one. And they're trying to use all kinds of very intelligent automation to make that less of a chore. And if you ask staff accountants in corporate accounting roles, my God, anything that AI can do to automatically generate the reversals, the accruals, the clearing entries, and, oh, they'd welcome that in spades. So, what people want, I think, is they want their time back. And if one way to get that is through automating huge chunks of the close using some of the newer advanced technologies, they're not going to have any problem getting people interested in that. So, it's not a, and also, we should bear in mind that it's getting really hard to attract people into the accounting profession. Uh, Colleges are having a real challenge getting people to even go into those programs. So I think the correct response from companies should have been to be aghast at that kind of a pronouncement that you saw at Sage Transform. But rather, they should be welcoming that because there's going to be a skills crunch. There already is one actually in this profession. It's just going to get worse. So it's the right time, and the message is probably appropriate.
So one thing I was really struck by, and I want to get into some of the questions that you were pressing around scale and performance and things like that. But before we do that, I just want to give the listeners a little bit of a context around Sage because I think I think you and I have in common that we weren't tracking like 10 years ago, like Sage, as much as we were engaging with Intacct, because Intacct was this up and coming cloud financials product. And it was quite, I think, a compelling value proposition to follow that company. And then they were acquired by Sage. And now what you really have is a pretty comprehensive offering that's so different to make sense of than before. You're talking about all these industry situations, all these operational questions and problems and challenges that they're trying to solve. You got verticals, everything from construction to manufacturing. They call it construction real estate. So, how do you kind of, if you're not like following this company closely, how would you describe their offerings at this time?
So I think you were right in categorizing the past. The past was a company that had acquired a large portfolio of products that didn't necessarily always play nice with each other. They were distinct kind of product lines, everything from Peachtree and Sage 50, Sage 100, Sage 200, and the
Hmm.
X3 manufacturing product. They all kind of had their target demographic, if you will, of who they were going to sell those into. They had, to some extent, even the channels were relatively distinct on who sold what. But the Intacct acquisition was interesting because it pushed them into a different kind of area, a space where now they had this super powerful um, accounting and finance solution that had functionality kind of on a par with much larger kind of vendors out there on the market. And the question was, what do you do with it? Well, I think it's taken a little while to kind of figure out what will they make of it. And it's clear that they've decided to make big chunks of Intacct now are the kind of the core satellite for some, like in their construction offerings and other vertical things that they're working on in professional services. So a lot of the data is now finding its way over to Intacct. And now this is like a second, I don't want to call it a renaissance, but it's an awakening around Intacct that is a much more valuable kind of solution for prospective buyers to look at.
Right. Valuable and in some ways more complicated to assess because, there's so many different areas of the footprint. And we could probably spend the whole podcast talking about the different plays that Sage is making. But one, I think, interesting part of this that I've enjoyed following, when I met with Steve Harrer, the CEO of Sage, for the first time, I told him, I was honest with him. I said, the day that I found out that you acquired Intacct, I was really depressed because I really liked Intacct as a standalone product. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have super good vibes around Sage's legacy play at that point in time. And I thought they're going to swallow Intacct and spit it out like an after dinner mint.
Well, let me
You know,
pile on your observation. I didn't get a chance to meet with Steve at that meeting, but I wasn't there. I was somewhere else on the planet. But I was concerned. It sounds bad in the way I'm going to say this, but British software companies just don't market as loud and enthusiastically and bombastically as North American software companies do. And I thought, here goes this really cool, hip, cool California company out of San Jose, Intacct. And now it's getting acquired by a very staid, British, long time, multi-decade old software company. I thought it was going to get lost in the shuffle, if you will. It would be buried and we'd never hear from it again from a marketing perspective. That would have been my concern when they did the deal.
yeah, for sure. And I think what's been interesting is that while, every acquisition has challenges, and I think I still see some challenges with what Sage is trying to do, but they did some smart things, one of which is, Steve was very honest about this in our conversation about recognizing the talent that Intacct had. And that includes folks like Dan Miller, who still plays a very prominent role leading a product here at Sage, and then also
Aaron.
Aaron Harris, CTO, who becomes an important figure just because of the impact of AI on everything.
Yep.
And the way that Sage has defined their architecture around what Sage calls, Aaron informally calls the Sage AI Factory. But the gist of it is that he's figured out how to deploy custom models across the Sage product line for AI and customer deployments. And so we're going to be learning a lot more about that as more customers adopt the solutions. But he thinks he's solved a lot of the problems around, how to train and update models for customers without getting into some of the treacherous areas around model drift and hallucination, stuff like that. But then also simultaneously through the Sage network, what they did is they figured out, well, instead of, for example, building invoice automation just for Sage Intacct customers, we're going to build that as a cloud service that all Sage customers can access. And so as a result of that, I think get back to your point around creating some cohesiveness around all of these products, right? And then what Sage has been able to do, which very few vendors that have a so-called legacy footprint have been able to do, is to say, you don't have to upgrade. You don't have end of maintenance. You like your product right now, you can do it, but you can consume your innovation through these cloud services and through these AI services. And when you're ready to upgrade, we can talk about that if you want to, or, So I think that puts them, I think, in an interesting position to try to differentiate around that, because most vendors, and there was just another one a few months ago that announced like end of maintenance for all their on-prem stuff, got to move to the latest. And it's like, I don't think customers like that, Brian, because I think customers want to move at their pace. So,
well, maybe the happy middle ground in between is some customers you're going to have to get behind them and push them a bit to make them do stuff.
right.
And I think that's probably appropriate in some cases.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen just what a world full of technical debt can do
Right.
to really bog down the space. And I'm not going to enthusiastically embrace laggardism, if there is such a word.
Right.
But
No, and I think it's less about laggardism, because I don't think you want that, but I think you do want to give customers a choice on where they prioritize their investments, right? So instead of saying you have to upgrade this core engine now that's working fine for you, like upgrade this other component that's going to give you an immediate result, like for example, invoice automation or whatever it is. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there comes a time where there has to be some tough love for customers. And there's probably a percentage of customers that you don't really want anymore, because they're not aggressive about collaborating with you. They don't really care. But I still think it's interesting to assess that from a Sage standpoint, because it's different than how a lot of vendors have done it. And what it does do is it gives all the Sage products have a little bit of coherence now under what, Aaron's talking about, what he's offering.
So I actually thought where you were going to go with the AI comment was a completely different direction. I think probably something the listeners really ought to check out is this thing they have called the digital fingerprint. And it's pretty cool, because what they're doing is they're using their payment network to capture information about invoices vendors are sending to customers. And based on that, they're able to identify these items or attributes of these digital invoices that help customers realize through the digital fingerprint, it maps out each invoice and can determine whether it's a legitimate one or not. And this is an AI application that's doing fraud detection in conjunction with the payment network that Sage already has. But it flags stuff that a user inside something like Intacct gets to take advantage of right away. I think this to me is like the right way to go with some of this technology. It's finding an all new kind of capability or service, whatever you want to call it, that can result from marrying up advanced technologies like machine learning with big data stores from collecting stuff from all over the customer base, and then applying that to a customer's individual current transaction. That's the kind of stuff that I think adds a lot of value. And that was the kind of AI messaging or examples that they were giving out here.
Right. And I want to ask you about your pesky questions. So I'm not going to go into this too much on AI, but I'm briefly going to just note that if listeners want to dig in a little further into Sage's AI software development plans, I wrote a piece after Transform on Diginomica called AI Software Development is Completely Different, how Sage plans to deliver enterprise AI with thousands of customer-specific finance models. And just real quick, on the back of that, a few points, which is, like a lot of companies, assessing what Sage is doing with AI can be challenging because they do have already live functionality in AI. Things like accounts payable automation, general ledger outlier detection are already live. Right. Simultaneously, they're working on a Copilot, which is more of the generative AI aspect, which is going to be rolling out gradually. And I think some customers will get access to some of that a little bit later this year. And then they announced a partnership with AWS for what Sage describes as the first domain-specific accounting large language model. I'm not 100% sure that's true, by the way, because I think I've read of one or two other ones. But the point is, they're one of the early ones getting in on trying to create more domain-specific models. And anyway, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that they're doing there. And the gist of it is, like a lot of vendors are doing, there's some nuances to what Sage is doing, but the good enterprise software vendors are working hard to figure out how to lower costs on AI and how to deliver this in a responsible and private way that ensures customer privacy and stuff like that. And so I don't want to break all of that out here because I want to ask you about your pesky questions because, Brian, you have a reputation for raising your hand at these events and perhaps
Are you going to get me in trouble?
Pressing the issue. Hey, you got yourself in trouble, I think. But no, that's good. I mean, I think it's good. I think you and I both come to these events with some axes to grind, and that's part of what we do is to figure out. There's no better way to kind of get a sense of where vendors stand than to press the issue. So, what were you pressing, and what did you learn?
Okay, so the quick recap on that. I think listeners ought to know that I'm a buy-side guy. I help clients. That's what I do for a living. I'm not selling research reports or anything like that. And I've got a lot of clients that either use or are looking at Intacct. And based on that, they have questions. I have questions, whatever. And some of them knew I was coming here to this analyst event. So I came armed with a bunch of things they wanted answers on. One of the questions had to do, several of the things are around scale. And, if you want, we can get right into that right now, John. But there are some customers. There are three areas in a financial system you're going to have a scale problem on. One is in the creation of financial reports, because whether you guys realize it or not on the call here, that some of these reports, you almost have to paint every cell on the report through the report writer. And the bigger a financial database gets and the more time periods you're crossing and so forth, the more counts you have to sum up to put one of these things together, then time just starts drifting away from you. So the question for these folks is, I know of a couple of accounts that are starting to hit some walls, and I want to know, where is the wall on this product on the upper end of what it takes, what Sage is able to do. I had some, the short of it all is I had some really interesting conversations. I actually missed a couple of the general sessions because I was out in the hallway hammering on some of the execs to get clarity on some of these points. And I know you got to listen in on one of those conversations. And I would say we ended up in a good place, but they know those issues are out there, and it's a question of sometimes maybe the partners aren't explaining stuff. Sometimes customers self-inflict some wounds, and some things are product related. But it all boils down to there has to be better education, better communication, and the like. And so that's a solvable issue. That's one. Another one had to do with their security audit, the SOC 1 deal. And what I thought might be a real problem turns out to be something that was, let's say, old news, that the auditors actually went back and relooked at stuff. Instead of having a qualified opinion, then it was fine. So that became a non-issue, but that was one of the things I brought up. Trying to think, what else?
There was one other thing that you were looking into, right? Which was, when you were talking about performance and scale and complexity, this gets back to the ESG topic that you and I taped a podcast on for listeners. If you want to track that, it's on the channel from before. ESG and scope 3, why is that a problem?
Because first of all, the volume of data that could come out could be intense for some companies. Think like a grocer, a wholesale distributor, somebody like Walmart. I mean, I couldn't imagine how much data would become flowing up. But there's also generally not a place for that in almost any ERP system. And so there are data model issues, there's performance issues, and we go on and on. But the bottom line is lots of vendors can tell you they're doing something around what's called scope 1 and scope 2, carbon emissions. But that's just a piece of the totality of what you have to do for ESG reporting. And finding a vendor that can really articulate a full-blown solution in that space is as rare as hen's teeth right now.
Absolutely. Well, I want to wrap this in a sec. And I think we're just in this podcast really just giving a flavor, because obviously there's a whole lot that we could talk about. But a couple things I did want to note. I thought it was refreshing in an analyst day that Sage started out with a couple of their local community partnerships here in Atlanta with Morehouse College, and also the Boss Network, which is an entrepreneurial community to support Black women, but also a Boss Impact Fund that funds Black female entrepreneurs. And I really liked how Aaron was able to connect that a little bit back into the AI messaging, and talking about how, listen, AI needs to serve communities, and you need a community to serve AI. Like, you don't, if you have a very limited, narrow demographic building these solutions out of Silicon Valley, they're not going to solve real world problems. And I thought it was really refreshing to have that, because in a lot of our analyst days, we don't really experience that flavor of community involvement. So I thought that set a good tone for the day's discussions.
If I get to pile on there, I had lunch with 3 of those ladies, and it was a riot. I thoroughly enjoyed lunch with them. So let's just say those ladies were some real people, and they were a real delight to hang with. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that set a really good tone for the day. There was some really interesting stuff on customer success, and some of the work that Sage is doing there with a customer health dashboard that I found refreshing. I'm going to be writing about that. They have a lot more work to do there, but I think they have an opportunity to make some progress. This is something I've been railing on vendors about, is why don't we have real-time, customer health assessments, just like, you could have a fitness watch wearing for your personal health. Why don't we have that for customers and projects? So I like to see that Sage was making some strong moves there. There's a lot more to do. And it was also fun to revisit multi-tenancy and why multi-tenancy matters. I don't think that conversation should go away. Aaron was pressing it. I think it's less about the nuances of an architecture versus like, how do you really support economies of scale for customers and not create cloud environments that are really expensive to run? We've had vendors tell us that they don't pass those costs on to customers. Sorry, that's bullshit.
Oh, absolute bullshit. Yeah, let's go ahead and let's deny that rumor right now. That's not true. They're trying every way around. And as a guy who's been looking at contracts lately, there's so many different charges, overage fees, toll charges, you name it. There's stuff cropping up all over the place. And my favorite still is we don't know what we're going to charge you yet, but trust us. We'll be good to you. And I'm like, yeah, right. And if I ever heard a car salesman tell me that, I'm running out of that dealership.
Yeah. And my final stage thing was Aaron saying customers need bespoke AI custom models, which is a much bigger challenge than multi-tenancy. And that's where some of the stuff he's working on comes in. And I wrote an article about some of that, so we don't need to dwell on that. But I think it's interesting just looking at the architectural challenges that it takes to actually think about AI for customers.
So I'll say that there are some problems out in the field that aren't getting addressed by vendors, not just Sage, but there's a lot of work vendors could do to make things better. And one of them is there's this huge issue about what about all our old historical data that may not have been stored in the same kind of accounting.
Oh, that was one of your other pesky questions.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
And there's issues about what do we do with that information and how do we use that to train up AI models? And that actually prompted a really interesting conversation here, because it turned out that we found out that when you kick off a product right off the bat, you have no there was no historical accounting data to train the models on. And so you
Yeah.
get no value out of the AI tools the first couple of months or whatever that you're going into production. And then they start learning about like the different invoices that are coming in and so forth, and it can get smarter. So that was a refreshing kind of data point to pick up on, because I don't think a lot of people understood that. And granted, I'm the guy in the room asking the question about like, so when you convert AP, you generally just pay all the old bills.
So the short answer that Sage gave to that one was that there's a way to incorporate a year's worth of stuff that's not like perfect, but it's good enough to begin to train the AI.
Correct. There's and the AI tools. Yeah, there's a way you could bring some historical stuff over, but you post it as either statistical records or they remain unposted transactions, and that's how they handle that. And that'll help you get through. But, this is a great example of there are some practical questions that these new advanced technologies trigger that people haven't discussed in the past. And we got to come up with some better answers and approaches for folks out in the field. The Sage folks actually had, like you said, they had an answer for that to make that a better, more valuable deal. But with a lot of these AI tools, more training, more transactions will get you better results over time.
Right. All right. So that's a wrap on Sage Analyst experience.